I knew something was wrong the moment I saw the dump trucks sitting at the end of my pasture like a funeral procession nobody had invited me to. There were 6 of them at first, then 9, then more, headlights rolling up behind them. All stopped dead in front of a steel gate I had paid good money to install. And the funniest part, if you can call any of this funny, was that every man out there looked offended, like my land had somehow betrayed them by belonging to me. My name is Caleb Warren, and for almost 17 years I owned a little piece of ground outside a town called Millstone, Arkansas. Not the kind of place anybody writes glossy magazine articles about, just 9.5 acres of open grass, red dirt, old pecan trees, a sagging equipment shed, and a white farmhouse with a porch that leaned a little to the left when the weather got wet. It was not fancy, not impressive, not the sort of property that makes people whisper at dinner parties, but it was mine, and that mattered more to me than most people understood. I bought it after my divorce, when I was 38 and tired in a way sleep could not fix, and that land became the first place in years where I could hear myself think. In the evenings I would sit on the porch with black coffee, sometimes bourbon, if the day had teeth, and listen to the cicadas screaming from the tree line while the whole town softened into dusk. Behind my place sat a larger stretch of undeveloped ground, maybe 50 acres, rough and wooded, with briars thick enough to tear your jeans and an old creek bed that only filled after hard rain. For years, nobody cared about it. Hunters asked permission once in a while. Teenagers cut across it on 4-wheelers, and every winter I would see deer moving through there like they owned the county. Then one spring, a little orange survey flag started popping up near my back fence, and a week later there were men in clean boots walking around with tablets, pointing at things, talking like the dirt had suddenly become important. A month after that, a big sign appeared near the county road, blue letters on white plywood. Future home of Brookhaven Meadows. Luxury living in the heart of Millstone. I remember laughing when I saw the word luxury, because the closest thing Millstone had to luxury was the gas station that finally got a cappuccino machine. The man behind the project was named Vaughn Kessler, and even before I met him, I knew his type because every small town has one. He had money from somewhere else, a smile made for newspaper photos, and that smooth habit of calling people neighbor right before he asked them to move out of his way. Folks at the diner said he was bringing growth, jobs, families, higher property values, all the magic words people use when they want you to stop asking where the traffic is going to go. I did not object to the subdivision at first. It was his land, or at least the land his company bought, and I have always believed a man has the right to do what he wants on his own property, as long as he remembers where his property ends. That last part turned out to be the problem. One Tuesday morning in late July, I left before sunrise to drive to a plumbing job 2 towns over. Nothing looked unusual when I pulled out. Same grass silver with dew. Same fence line. Same broken mailbox I kept meaning to replace. I came home around 6 that evening. Sweaty, hungry, and in no mood for surprises, and I nearly hit my brakes hard enough to throw my toolbox through the windshield. There was a road across my field. Not tire marks. Not a muddy track. Not some temporary path made by a couple of careless workers, but a real construction access road, graded flat, covered in fresh crushed stone, wide enough for concrete trucks, cutting clean from the county road across the corner of my pasture toward the Brookhaven property behind me. I sat in my truck for a minute with one hand still on the wheel, just staring, because my brain kept trying to make it into something else. Maybe the county had done work. Maybe I misunderstood my boundary. Maybe I was tired. But I knew that land. I'd walked it in rain, heat, snow, and heartbreak. I had buried 2 dogs under the pecan tree 20 yards from where that gravel started. So I got out, walked the whole thing, and the farther I went, the colder I felt. Somebody had sent heavy equipment onto my land, cut through my pasture, scraped away grass and soil, laid stone, packed it down, and left it there like a receipt for disrespect. There is a very particular anger that comes when someone steals something from you quietly, then expects you to be polite about noticing. I found a number on the Brookhaven Meadows sign and called it right there with my boot in the gravel. A woman answered, then transferred me, and after a few clicks a man came on with a voice so relaxed it sounded rehearsed. "This is Vaughn," I said. "Vaughn, this is Caleb Warren, and you just built a road across my property." There was a pause, not long, but long enough for me to know he understood exactly what I meant. Then he gave a little chuckle, the kind of chuckle rich men use when they are deciding whether you are worth taking seriously. "Mr. Warren, that is just temporary construction access. We have crews that need to get to the back section. I looked down at the crushed stone under my boots and said, "It is temporary access on permanent land that belongs to me." He sighed then, not apologetic, more like I had made his afternoon inconvenient. "Our site team believed there was an old utility easement through that corner." I said, "There is not." He said, "Well, these things get messy." I said, "No, Vaughn, muddy boots get messy. This is trespassing." His voice tightened a little. "Caleb, we are investing a substantial amount of money into this community, and I think everyone benefits if we stay flexible." Flexible. I still hate that word when it comes from people who want your backbone to bend for their budget. I told him I wanted the road removed and my field restored. He said they would look into it. I said, "You have until my lawyer says you do." Then I hung up, and I remember standing there in that stupid fresh gravel, listening to crickets start up along the fence, feeling like my quiet little place had just been pulled into a fight it never asked for. The next morning, I called Marla Baines, an attorney in Pine Bluff, who had helped my cousin with a boundary dispute years earlier. Marla was in her 60s, sharp as barbed wire, with a voice that could make a bank manager apologize to a chair. She told me to send pictures, my deed, my survey, everything I had. By lunch, she had pulled the county records. By 4:30, she called back and said, "Caleb, there is no easement, no access agreement, no recorded right-of-way, nothing. That road is sitting on your land because somebody decided it would be easier to ask forgiveness than permission." I was not surprised, but hearing it out loud still did something to me. It settled my anger into something heavier, something steadier. Marla drafted a formal demand letter that night. Stop using the road immediately. Remove the gravel. Restore the pasture. 10 days to comply. She told me to keep calm, document everything, and not get into shouting matches with contractors. I told her I was a plumber, not a preacher, but I would try. For about 24 hours, I thought the letter might be enough. I really did. I imagined Vaughn reading it, calling his people, maybe swearing into a speakerphone, then deciding the smart move was to back up and fix the mistake before it got expensive. That was my first mistake. My second mistake was assuming a man like Vaughn Kessler saw consequences the same way regular people do, because 2 days after the letter arrived, the trucks did not stop. They doubled. The first morning after the trucks doubled, I stood by my kitchen window with a mug of coffee cooling in my hand and watched a concrete mixer roll across my pasture like it had paid taxes there. Behind it came 2 pickups, a flatbed loaded with pipe, and a little white SUV with a Brookhaven Meadows decal on the door, all of them bouncing over that gravel road like it was the most natural thing in the world. I did not run outside. I did not throw anything. I did not stand in the middle of the road waving my arms like a man in a bad country music video, although I will admit the thought crossed my mind. Instead, I did what Marla told me to do. I took pictures. I wrote down times. I recorded license plates. I kept a notebook on the kitchen table, and every time another truck went through, I made another mark. It felt ridiculous at first, like I was doing homework for a class called How to Be Disrespected Legally. But after 3 days, that notebook had more traffic records than the county sheriff. Vaughn called me once during that week, not to apologize, not to offer a deal, but to soften me up. He said, "Caleb, I understand this feels personal." I said, "It feels personal because it is my personal property." He gave that little salesman laugh again and said, "We are not trying to take anything from you." I looked out the window at tire dust rising off my field and said, "That is a strange sentence to say while your trucks are driving across my land." He went quiet, then changed tactics. He talked about jobs, families, housing shortages, the town growing whether I liked it or not. He said my little corner of pasture was causing a major bottleneck. I told him my pasture had managed to exist for 17 years without becoming a municipal crisis. That was the first time I heard him get truly angry. "You know," he said, "most people would be reasonable here." I said, "Most people would ask before building a road." Then I hung up, which I recommend highly as a life skill when someone is trying to make their bad decision your moral failure. Marla filed the lawsuit the following Monday. Trespass, property damage, unlawful use, request for injunctive relief, all words that sound dry until they are the only thing standing between you and a man with bulldozers. Once the filing hit public record, Millstone did what Millstone always did. It talked. The diner talked. The feed store talked. The barber shop talked so much that by Thursday, 3 different men had explained my own land to me using maps they drew on napkins. Some folks were completely on my side. Earl Haskins, who ran the tire shop, told me if somebody built a road across his land, he would have parked a tractor sideways and charged admission. My neighbor Ruth, who baked pies for half the town and knew more secrets than the courthouse, brought me peach cobbler and said, "Honey, men like Vaughan only understand doors when they close on their fingers," but other people thought I was being stubborn. One woman at church said, "Well, Caleb, maybe this development will help the town." I said, "I hope it does." She said, "Then why fight it?" And I remember telling her, because helping the town should not require pretending I do not own what I own. That was the part people kept missing. I was not against houses. I was not against families moving in. I was not against progress, whatever that word means after a developer gets hold of it. I was against being treated like a speed bump. The first hearing came on a grey morning in August, the kind where the air felt wet before the rain even started. Vaughan walked into court wearing a navy suit and polished shoes, with two attorneys beside him and a face that said he had never once expected to lose in a room with fluorescent lights. I wore my only decent jacket, the one I kept for funerals and bank meetings, and Marla sat beside me with a yellow legal pad and the calm expression of a woman who had already sharpened the knife. Vaughan's attorney went first. He was smooth. I will give him that. He talked about economic benefit, necessary access, community development, project timelines, contractor obligations, and how stopping the access road would create serious hardship. Serious hardship. I almost laughed, because there is nothing quite like hearing a man describe the consequences of his own trespassing as if nature itself had wronged him. Then he said something that made my jaw tighten. "Your Honor, this is a practical solution to a logistical problem." Marla stood up slowly, like she'd been waiting for that exact sentence to wander into traffic. She said, "Your Honor, practicality does not create property rights. My client did not donate his land, lease his land, grant an easement, or invite Mr. Kessler's company to build on it. The defendant created the logistical problem by ignoring the boundary, and now asks the court to reward that decision because undoing it would be inconvenient." She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The judge, a tired-looking man named Harold Voss, who seemed allergic to nonsense, reviewed the survey, the deed, the photographs, and then looked over his glasses at Vaughan's table. He said, "Counsel, am I correct that there is no recorded easement?" Vaughan's attorney shifted. "None recorded, Your Honor, but there may be historical use." The judge said, "By whom?" The attorney said, "We are still investigating." The judge leaned back and said, "So at present you have no evidence of a legal right to cross Mr. Warren's land?" The room got very quiet. Finally, the judge ruled that Brookhaven had to stop using the road immediately, remove the gravel within 14 days, and restore my pasture. He said it in the plainest way possible. No thunder, no speech, just a man weeding consequences into the record. I walked out of that courthouse lighter than I had felt in weeks. I honestly thought, well, that is it, he tried. He lost. And now everybody goes home embarrassed, but wiser. Looking back, that thought was adorable. 14 days passed. The truck stopped using the road, because even Vaughan was not foolish enough to drive straight through an injunction in daylight, but the gravel stayed. The scar across my field stayed. The orange cones stayed. The little Brookhaven sign stayed like flags planted by an army that had retreated but still wanted credit for invading. On day 15, Marla filed for enforcement. On day 16, I called a fencing contractor named Luis Ortega, a quiet man with forearms like fence posts and the most comforting habit of measuring twice before speaking. I showed him the survey. I showed him exactly where my boundary ran. I told him I wanted a gate, not a pretty gate, not a charming rural entrance with wagon wheels on it. I wanted a gate that looked like the end of a conversation. Luis nodded and said, "You want polite or permanent?" I said, "Permanent can be polite." He smiled and said, "I can do that." Marla reviewed every step before I did anything. The posts were set inside my property line. The gate locked inside my property line. Then, along the edge where a driver might try to swing around through the grass, Lewis dug a shallow drainage trench. Nothing dangerous, nothing hidden, just enough to make it clear that my field was not a backup plan. I took pictures of that too. By then, documentation had become my second language. 3 mornings later, the show began. I was on the porch before 7, drinking coffee, when I heard engines down by the road. First one dump truck pulled in, then another, then a concrete truck, then pickups with crews inside, all arriving as if nobody had told them the road had become a legal ghost. They rolled up to the gate and stopped. For a few seconds nothing happened. Then doors opened. Men climbed down, stretched, pointed, frowned, checked phones, rattled the lock, and stared at the trench like it had personally insulted their mothers. One guy put his hands on his hips and looked toward my house. I raised my coffee mug because I am not made of stone. About 40 minutes later, my phone rang. It was Vaughn. He did not say hello. He said, "Open the gate." I said, "Good morning to you too." He said, "Caleb, do not play games with me." I looked at the line of trucks and said, "Vaughn, if this is a game, you brought the board, the pieces, and the rulebook." He said, "You are delaying a multi-million-dollar project." I said, "No, I'm sitting on my porch. You delayed your project when you built a road on land you did not own." Then came the threats, lost profits, contractor penalties, investor damages, lawsuits, numbers big enough to impress a banker and bore a judge. He talked for a long time, and I let him, because sometimes the kindest thing you can do is allow a man to hear himself run out of excuses. When he finally stopped, I said, "Vaughn, you had my phone number before you had my gravel. You chose the order." He hung up. After that, Brookhaven Meadows began to bleed money in ways you could not see from the road, but everyone in town could feel. Crews got reassigned. County inspectors postponed visits. Permit revisions stalled. Equipment sat idle. Subcontractors started grumbling at the diner, which meant by Friday every waitress in Millstone knew more about Vaughn's construction schedule than his investors probably did. Vaughn went back to court asking for emergency relief, claiming the gate and trench had caused severe financial harm. Marla called me afterward and said the judge was not impressed. She said, "Caleb, he basically told them a self-inflicted wound does not become your emergency." I should have felt victorious. Maybe part of me did. But mostly I felt tired, because the whole thing was so stupid it almost circled back around to sad. A road that could have been a conversation had become a lawsuit. A shortcut had become a blockade. A man who wanted everything fast had managed to slow himself down harder than I ever could have. And just when I thought the story had reached peak foolishness, Marla called me one evening and said, "You are going to want to sit down for this." I was standing in the kitchen, washing a coffee mug, and I said, "Unless Vaughn bought common sense, I doubt it." Marla did not laugh. She said, "We got records from a planning consultant. Caleb, they warned him about your land before construction ever started." For a few seconds, I just stood there with soap on my hands, listening to Marla breathe on the other end of the phone, because there is a difference between suspecting a man knew better and finding out he had been told in writing. Marla said the consultant's memo was not dramatic, not emotional, not the kind of thing that would make a jury gasp. It was worse than that. It was boring and clear, which in legal matters is usually where the bodies are buried. The memo said the proposed temporary access across my pasture would require permission from the landowner or a recorded easement, and if neither existed, construction should not proceed through that route. There it was, plain as daylight, before the gravel, before the trucks, before Vaughn laughed on the phone and acted like I was confused. Somebody on his own team had warned him that my land was not a shortcut. He could simply borrow. I asked Marla if that changed anything. She said it changed the temperature. That was her way of saying Vaughn had not stepped into a puddle. He had ignored a sign that said deep water and then blamed me for not building him a bridge. After that, the town's sympathy shifted in a way you could almost hear. People who had told me to be reasonable got quieter. The woman from church who had asked why I was fighting the project stopped me in the parking lot one Sunday and said, "I did not know he had been warned." I said, "Neither did I, but I knew he had been told no by the time he kept going." She nodded like that settled something inside her. Vaughn, meanwhile, was running out of charming options. Since my land was off the table, he had to negotiate with a retired cattleman named Roy Pettit, who owned a narrow strip on the far side of the Brookhaven property that touched Old Quarry Road. Roy was 72, hard of hearing when it suited him, and famous for once making a car salesman cry by asking him to explain undercoating 6 different ways. He did not care about luxury living, community growth, or Vaughn's investor schedule. He cared about price, and because everyone in Millstone knew Vaughn was desperate, Roy cared about price with enthusiasm. The negotiations dragged on for weeks, then months. Every time I heard another rumor at the diner, the number got higher. First it was 40,000, then 65, then somewhere north of 100 after drainage work and legal fees. Whether the exact number was right, I cannot swear to it, but I know this much. Vaughn paid enough to make him stop laughing, and buying that strip did not solve the whole problem. Engineers had to redesign the entrance. Surveyors came back. Utility plans changed. The county wanted updated drainage studies because Old Quarry Road dipped near the creek. Permits had to be amended. Contractors wanted compensation for delays. A framing crew that had been lined up for the first phase took another job in Conway. Brookhaven Meadows did not die, but it limped for a long time, and every limp has a cost. Almost 11 months after I came home and found that road across my field, a small crew arrived to remove it. This time they did not come roaring in like conquerors. They came slowly, with paperwork, a foreman, and a county inspector watching from his truck. I stood by the fence while an excavator scraped up the crushed stone in long grey coals. The sound was ugly, metal teeth against packed gravel, but I will admit it was one of the prettiest things I had heard in a year. Truck after truck carried it away. Then they brought in topsoil, spread it, braided it, seeded it, and covered the ground with straw so the rain would not wash it all into the ditch. Near the end of the day, the foreman, a broad-shouldered man with sunburned cheeks, walked over and leaned against the fence beside me. He looked at the field, then at the gate, then back at the field. He said, "Whole thing could have been avoided with one knock on your door." I laughed, not because it was funny, but because after months of motions, hearings, affidavits, surveys, invoices, threats, and small-town gossip, this man had summarized the entire mess in 11 words. One knock on my door. That was all. Maybe I would have said no. Maybe I would have said yes for a limited time with a written agreement and a restoration bond. Maybe I would have asked for enough money to fix the roof on my equipment shed and finally replace the porch steps. We will never know, because Vaughn made the decision before I was allowed to answer. That was the wound under everything. It was not gravel. It was not noise. It was not even money. It was the insult of someone deciding my consent was just a detail they could clean up later. A few months after the field turned green again, I saw Vaughn at a county planning meeting. He looked different, not broken, not exactly, but worn down around the edges, like a man who had spent too many nights staring at spreadsheets that refused to forgive him. We had never actually met face to face before that, which is strange when you think about it. Two grown men spending nearly a year in a fight without once standing close enough to smell each other's coffee. He saw me near the back of the room and walked over. I braced myself, because old habits are hard to drop. But he did not threaten me. He did not smile for the crowd. He just stood there for a moment and said, "You know, everyone told me you would eventually take the money." I said, "Everyone told me you'd eventually ask permission." For the first time, he gave a real laugh, not the polished that he'd chuckle from the phone, not the boardroom's sound, but something tired and human. He looked toward the floor and said, "That road cost me a lot more than money." I said, "I figured it did." That was all. No handshake, no apology carved in stone, no dramatic music. Unless you count the old microphone squealing at the front of the meeting room. But the fight ended there in a way the court papers never quite managed. Life went on, because it always does. Brookhaven Meadows eventually opened with its stone entrance on Old Quarry Road, and families moved in, and kids started riding bikes where survey flags used to be. My pasture grew back uneven at first, then thick, then almost exactly like before, except I never looked at that corner the same way again. The gate stayed, not because I expected Vaughn to come back, but because some lessons deserve a monument. I do not hate the man. That surprises people when I say it. I think he made a selfish decision, then protected that decision until it became too expensive to defend, which is a very human kind of foolishness, just dressed in nicer shoes than most. But I also think there are moments in life when being polite is not the same as being good, and being flexible is not the same as being fair. Sometimes the only decent thing you can do is stand still and say no, calmly, legally, with the receipt in your hand. So that is my question for you. If you had been in my boots, would you have taken the money and let the road stay for a while? Or would you have locked the gate and fought the principal no matter what it cost? And if you were on Vaughn's side, trying to keep a major project alive with workers, lenders, and families waiting, do you think he was a villain? Or just a man who made one arrogant mistake and paid for it harder than he expected? Tell me in the comments. Because stories like this are never as simple as one good guy and one bad guy. Like the video, if you believe boundaries still matter, share it with someone who's ever had a neighbor push too far. And subscribe for more real-life stories where one small decision turns into a courtroom, a locked gate, and a lesson nobody forgets.